another chewing gum and interesting facts. And today you'll notice that I have donned some kind of work uniform. And I am fully here in the clinic. It's kind of a weird clinic. If someone tries to offer you medical services in a place that looks like this, best to say no. Just gonna put that out there. But in any case, we are back today for another gum chewing and interesting fact. And today we're going to be talking about 50 different bizarre medical cases. Now, these are not medical cases that I have seen personally. Some of them I have probably come in contact with at some point or another. But they're just interesting phenomena that exist in the medical world. Some of them have valid explanations and some of them do not. And it's all very interesting. So I'm super excited to bring this to you today. I'm also really excited to be back after 60 days of ASMR. This is the second video that is going up after the 60 days of ASMR. Still in the process of catching up on a bunch of housekeeping items for the channel, but I've managed to get some giveaway items shipped out. And so if you want a giveaway item and you haven't gotten in touch with me, you should definitely do that. I post all of the giveaway winners on the community tabs post section on the channel, so go have a look there. If you haven't got a notification, worth having a check there and make sure. I don't want to miss this. I want to get you your giveaway item. So alright, I've got some gum. This gum is called Chew gum. I'm switching it up from the usual minty stuff for something a little bit more interesting. So this should be really fun. And yeah, I'm looking forward to digging into this with you guys. At least I think it's gum. I hope it's gum. It's not chewing like gum. But you know what? We'll figure it out. I just assume that it is gum. But we'll figure it out. Alright, let's get started. The first bizarre medical case is foreign accent syndrome. After a stroke or head trauma, some people suddenly begin speaking with completely different accent, like a lifelong American waking up with an Irish lilt. The phenomenon is caused by damage to the brain's speech centers, changing the rhythm, tone, and pronunciation, while leaving language comprehension intact. Though rare, it can have major emotional and social impacts on those affected. No doubt about that. Because imagine someone that you've known forever now has like a Japanese accent or something like that, a Russian accent. It might be a bit alarming. And also, I would imagine that some people might think that those people are being like intentionally offensive or something. That's a weird, wild, and tough one. Alright, next one. Tree man syndrome. This condition, formerly called epidermodysplasia verruconiformis, allows HPV to cause wart-like growths that resemble tree bark. You've probably seen this on like Discovery Channel or something, because in like some very remote places where access to healthcare is very limited, sometimes people might be able to get quite bad in their disease state. Patients often require dozens of surgery to remove the growth, which can severely limit hand and foot function. It's caused by an extremely rare immune defect and has no known cure. That's wild. So, the immune system down, some kind of defect, and then this fungal infection can spread like wildfire because the immune system that would normally fight that is just not packing any punch. So that's wild. Okay, we've talked about this next one before on the channel. The laughing epidemic of Tanganyika, 1962. An outbreak in a Tanzanian village began when a few schoolgirls started laughing uncontrollably, and soon the infection spread to hundreds. Infection. The laughter fits could forcing schools to close. That's crazy. Researchers now believe it was a case of mass psychogenic illness triggered by social stress. That's pretty wild. I don't think this is gum. That's my mistake. But you know what? It's called high chew for a reason. You just keep chewing. See what happens, right? Alien hand syndrome. One hand acts as though it has a mind of its own, sometimes grabbing objects or undoing the actions of the other hand. Imagine you're constantly battling. That'd be crazy. It results from damage to brain areas like the corpus callosum or frontal lobe, often after surgery or stroke. Patients can see their hand moving, but feel powerless to stop it. That's terrible. That's a pretty bad one. Exploding head syndrome. Oh, that sounds terrible. Of all the diseases that I've heard about, exploding head syndrome. You can send that one back. I will say that. Just as a person is drifting to sleep, they may hear a loud bang, crash, or electrical zap. Even though nothing happened, it is thought to be caused by a brief glitch in the brain's sensory system during the sleep-wake transition. Though harmless, it can be unsettling enough to cause anxiety around bedtime. That's terrible. It is sometimes normal to have sort of vivid imagery or hallucinations around falling into sleep and waking from sleep. They're called hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations, and it's possible that those hallucinations could be auditory. That might be what this is. I don't know why they call it exploding head syndrome, because that's wild. Blue skin family of Kentucky. In the 1800s, a family living in the Appalachian region developed deep blue skin due to a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia. This condition affects the blood's ability to carry oxygen, causing a blue tint. They lived healthy lives otherwise, and the trait gradually disappeared as the family intermarried with outsiders. Imagine, you're trying to date someone and you're blue. That would be weird. I can't imagine what that would be like. Which way do you swipe on a blue person? That's for you to decide. That's not up for me to decide. Okay. This one is a very sad one. And I urge you not to Google pictures of it because it's pretty unsettling. It's called harlequin ichthyosis, a severe genetic skin disorder where newborns are born encased in thick, plaque-like scales separated by deep cracks. The condition can impair movement, breathing, and temperature regulation, making intensive care crucial. Modern treatments have improved survival rates dramatically, with some patients now living into adulthood. It's a terrible illness. They're prone to infections and all kinds of other problems. And yeah, I can only send positive thoughts to the families of people having children born with this terrible illness. It's just awful. Okay. On a lighter note, pee growing in the lungs, and that's PEA. Important to clarify. A man in Massachusetts developed a persistent cough that baffled doctors until an X-ray revealed a pea sprout in his lung. Doctors believe he accidentally inhaled the pea, which germinated due to the moisture and warmth inside the lung. The sprout was removed, and his symptoms quickly resolved. Can you imagine? That's wild. That bee hopped in and was like, this is my turf now. That's wild. Careful what you inhale, people. Brain tapeworm. A man experienced seizures for years before a brain scan revealed a tapeworm lodged in his brain tissue. The parasite, likely contracted from undercooked pork, had formed a cyst that interfered with brain function. Surgical removal and medication finally ended his symptoms. are like a big iceberg. And symptoms, what we experience, or signs that we can see or observe, might be that top 10%. Meanwhile, there's this whole crazy thing lurking under the surface. And it's not until something manifests or breaches the surface that we can really be aware of it. So, it's possible for diseases to be slowly rumbling along without giving any symptoms until it gets much worse. And this guy probably had tapeworms for a long time. Terrible. Terrible. Oh, I've seen this a bunch. Live spider in ear canal. Terrible. Several documented cases tell of patients hearing scratching or buzzing inside their ear only to find a living spider. These arachnids often crawl in while a person sleeps and become trapped. Removal usually provides instant relief. A story to tell forever. Unfortunately, especially during the summer months, like the spring, summer, fall, insects in the ears are a pretty common thing to see in an emergency department. And if they're alive, they can be really hard to get out. So sometimes you put in like lidocaine and it takes care of that, and then you can remove them after that. Pretty wild. Okay. The next one is called Cotard's delusion, a psychiatric disorder in which patients believe they are dead, missing organs, or do not exist at all. Often linked to severe depression or brain injury, this rare occurrence has fascinated medical professionals and often leaves lasting impressions on patients and their families. That's wild. I can't imagine that. Imagine fully believing that you are dead or missing organs. That is terrifying. And I can only imagine how distressing that would be. So, that's a pretty bad one. Gosh. Alright, next is Morgellons disease. Patients report fibers or threads emerging from their skin, along with crawling sensations. Its cause is debated with theories ranging from skin conditions to delusional parasitosis. This rare occurrence has fascinated medical professionals and often leaves lasting impressions on patients and their families. This is a really tough one. I've definitely seen people in my dealings with delusional parasitosis. You have this fixed false belief that you are infested with parasites, and despite testing showing there's none and other kind of reassurances, they can't seem to break this fixed false belief, this delusion, and it's often very distressing for people. And oftentimes they end up being over-medicalized, so sent to infectious disease specialists or internal medicine, other types of things, when really probably what they need is psychiatry. It's a really tough one. I really feel for these people. Alright, next one is walking corpse syndrome. Similar to Cotard's, patients insist they are dead and may neglect eating or self-care, believed to be linked to brain damage affecting self-perception. This rare occurrence has fascinated medical professionals and often leaves lasting impressions on patients and their families. What a wild name for an illness, and what a wild illness. I can't even imagine what that would be like, but obviously very distressing and dangerous if someone is not able to care for themselves because of it. That's fascinating. Next is Stone Man syndrome. Fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva turns muscle and connective tissue into bone over time, gradually immobilizing the body. This rare occurrence has fascinated medical professionals and often leaves lasting impressions. That is terrible. You know, our movement requires so much in terms of tissue, from the muscles to joints working as pulley systems, to the ligaments that hold joints together, the tendons that attach the muscle to the bone, and hardening of those structures would really have a dramatic impact on a person's ability to mobilize. That's a really terrible one. Next is fish odor syndrome. Not ideal. Not fascinated medical professionals and often leaves lasting impressions on patients and their families. That's wild. You have to imagine that in our diet, through consuming proteins, we take in a lot of amino acids. Amino acids are like the building blocks of proteins, and protein breakdown requires the use of other proteins called enzymes, which kind of bind and help break down these things. And if you're lacking an enzyme to break down a certain amino acid, then you're cooked. Fish smell. Not ideal. Hard to make friends that way. Definitely. Okay. Oh my goodness. Persistent. Forgive me for this one, guys. Persistent arousal disorder. A rare condition where individuals experience unwanted and persistent arousal unrelated to sexual desire and often due to nerve dysfunction. This rare occurrence is fascinating to both patients and their families, no doubt. And I could certainly see how that could be obstructive for everyday life. But we'll leave it there. We're going to leave that one right where it is. Okay, black hairy tongue. Overgrowth of papillae on the tongue traps food and bacteria, creating a dark, furry appearance. If you look at your tongue really close up, you'll see that there's these little tendrils. They're called papilla, and some people experience an overgrowth of those, so they get bigger, and then stuff gets stuck in it. Not ideal. Usually harmless and reversible with more aggressive oral hygiene. This rare occurrence has fascinated medical professionals and often leaves lasting impressions. I mean, all of these things would leave a lasting impression, I would say. That's a tough one, though. I've not seen that in the flesh, not in person. Okay, this one's interesting. Auto-brewery syndrome. The gut ferments carbohydrates into alcohol, causing drunkenness without drinking, linked to yeast overgrowth in the digestive system. This rare occurrence has fascinated medical professionals. Yeah, of course. If you imagine, our skin is cultured, meaning it's a place where things live, and it's cultured with different types of bacteria and different types of fungus, and it's the same for our digestive tract. But our skin is also a formidable barrier, and our immune system in the body helps to keep everything regulated. And if you have one type of bacteria that overgrows, or one type of yeast, for example, that overgrows, it can throw the whole biome into disarray. You know, it's like your cousin Larry comes for a visit, brings his big tractor trailer, doesn't leave. He sticks around, it's going to throw things off a little bit, right? It's the same thing. This is the same thing. But that would be really terrible to have this auto brewery going on. Not ideal. Okay. Foreign body ingestion collections. Doctors have removed hundreds of objects from patients' stomachs, from coins to entire sets of cutlery, due to psychiatric conditions such as pica, which we'll talk about. So this is unfortunately a really common one, especially kids like to put stuff in their noses and eat stuff that they shouldn't. You know, things like batteries, very dangerous, like those button batteries, super dangerous to eat. For if kids eat one of those, you got to get them to the emergency department. Another thing that can be bad is like magnets, little magnets. If they eat more than one magnet, and then they start passing through the digestive tract, and they stick together like that, it can actually impair the bowel's ability to do its thing with digestion, leading to blockages and ulcerations and perforations and stuff like that. So ingestions can be really bad, but it's still really interesting and very common. It's something that we see a lot of. Okay. Hyperthymesia. Individuals can recall nearly every detail of their lives in vivid detail, extremely rare, possibly linked to enlarged brain have an ability to remember a ton of stuff. If you've been paying attention to the channel for some time now, you'll know that I'm terrible at remembering names. It's just my lot in life, guys. It's just where I'm at. So, some people are the opposite. They can remember everything, every detail, and it's so fascinating. Stendhal syndrome. Overwhelming physical and emotional symptoms triggered by exposure to great art or beauty, including dizziness, palpitations, and confusion. Yeah, so that's pretty wild. Of course, if you've ever, seen something and been, really moved by it, this is not that. This is, a really severe version of that, where people are, almost gonna pass out because they're so stoked about whatever that artwork was. I've definitely been, overwhelmed. Like Avengers Endgame. I was overwhelmed. I'm just gonna put it that way. And it happens, and that's okay. That's normal. That's okay. But if you start passing out because you're, really, overwhelmed when you look at, a Monet or, a Francis Bacon painting or something like that, then that's, kind of extending beyond the normal. So that's a whole interesting thing, though. Okay, progeria, a genetic disorder causing rapid aging in children, often leading to death from heart disease in early adolescence. Yeah, I've definitely heard of this, but I've never seen it in my medical dealings. But it's it is a pretty rare condition. Ooh, this one's spooky. Werewolf syndrome. Hypertrichosis causes excessive hair growth all over the body. It can be congenital or triggered by certain medications. So this is, a pretty rare thing also. It's something that I've also not seen. But, if you can imagine, we have typical places where hair grows, and some of us have more hair than others. This is well outside of that kind of normal variation, and it can be very impairing for people. So a lot of these are really, really tough. Okay, this one's interesting. Aquagenic urticaria. This is a water allergy. It causes hives and itching upon contact with water, regardless of temperature. This is also extremely rare, and as you can imagine, very dangerous because we need water to live. This would definitely require a specialist to have a closer look and see what kind of treatments can be done to try to modulate this allergic reaction. Urticaria is like hives. It's like that itchy rash that you get if you're having an allergic reaction. And it can be very annoying, right? Because it's itchy. But for really severe cases, it can actually be dangerous. You can even have a systemic, we call, involving the whole body and internal organs, allergic effects that can be really dangerous. Okay, this one is super interesting. It's called pica, a psychological disorder where people crave and eat non-food substances like chalk, dirt, or glass, often linked to mineral deficiencies or psychiatric illness. So I've definitely seen this, and it's pretty rare, but it is common in some psychiatric illnesses, but it's also common in things like iron deficiency. And it can actually be really problematic because people be eating dirt, and that's not ideal for your gut health. And it's also risky because it can cause impaction. It can also cause obstructions and things like that, and you can get really sick from eating contaminated things. So it can be very dangerous for people. Okay, sleep eating disorder. People unknowingly prepare and eat food while asleep, sometimes consuming inedible items. That's one that I definitely do not need. I will say that. But kind of scary too, right? Because if you can imagine, you're kind of sleeping in some kind of autopilot. If you leave the stove on or something like that, it can be actually really dangerous for you and the people around you. And so this is a tricky one for sure. Okay, next is savant syndrome. Individuals individuals with developmental conditions like autism display extraordinary abilities in memory, art, or calculation far beyond the average person. You've all heard of things like, popularized in the media, like Rain Man, who was really quite quick with counting and like math equations and stuff. I've heard of people with gifts like being able to perform music, or being able to produce like massively amazing pieces of artwork despite having some functional disabilities. And it's such a fascinating thing that I don't think any of us really truly understand. Okay, here's another one. Capgras delusion, a psychiatric disorder where a person believes friends or family have been replaced by identical imposters. Can you imagine? That would be very scary for those people who truly believe this. And gosh, there's also conditions where people, think that inanimate objects are people, or, sometimes those wires get a bit crossed, and it can be pretty impactful for people, unfortunately. Polydactyly, people born with extra fingers or toes, which can be functional or cosmetic. Yeah, we've probably always heard about that, when you have a baby, and then you're like, did you count the fingers? I think a lot of people joke about that, but I think it can be pretty impairing for people, especially if they're non-functional, or if they're, depending on, how they are, essentially, for people. Okay, this one's interesting. Mirror touch synesthesia. When a person sees someone being touched, they physically feel the sensation on their own body. That would be devastating if you're into, like, UFC or, like, karate, judo, whatever, something like that, right? If you see someone get whacked and you feel pain, that would be terrible. Arguably, these people are, like, extremely empathetic to the people around them, but that is fascinating. Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Distorted perception of size, time, and space, often linked to migraines or epilepsy. Wow. I've never heard that, actually. I've certainly, when you see someone with a migraine, oftentimes it's pretty common to have some kind of visual distortion associated with that. We call it an aura. It's like a shimmering light in their field of vision. They can also have, like, the phonophobia or photophobia, which is like, the light bothers them, sounds bother them, and stuff like that. But I've never heard of someone's perception when it relates to size or time and the space around them to be distorted. And I think that's really fascinating. That's very fascinating, but also very scary. I would imagine if that was coming on, it'd be really difficult to break out of the migraine because you're just really big in a really small room, or vice versa, right? It'd be pretty crazy. Jumping Frenchmen of Maine. That's got a ring to it. Well, I will say that has a ring to it. A rare startle disorder where individuals respond to sudden stimuli with exaggerated jumps, shouts, or compulsive imitation. That's interesting. It sounds like a tic, right? A tic is like an involuntary behavior that some people have, and it sounds a bit similar to that, but this seems to have a definitive trigger if they are startled. That's very interesting. Okay, next one, brace yourself. This is wild, and I don't know how this could be ever possible, but allegedly, spontaneous human combustion. What? Rare reports of people allegedly catching fire without an external source, often explained by the wick effect and environmental factors. We're gonna have to Google the wick effect. Let's look that up right now. What is the wick effect? We're gonna do some deep diving here. The wick effect, also known as the candle effect, describes a process where a person's body fat can act as fuel for a fire. Ew. Oh, some things are better left ungoogled, I would say. I wish I didn't know that, but of course, I guess it makes sense. Fat is it's obviously an oil of sorts, and yeah, that's a terrible thing to think about. But I mean, it's hard for me to imagine, not just like an ignition source, but also like there's so many things. Like our skin is kind of a bit of a conductive barrier, and we are big, saggy bags of fluid. You know what I mean? So I can't imagine without some kind of accelerant applied that that would really go anywhere. But allegedly. But I think there's more to the story. Okay, this next one is very interesting. It's called Kuru. And I think, if my memory serves me right, it's actually called Kuru. A fatal brain disease once found among the 4 people of Papua New Guinea, transmitted through ritual cannibalism. My goodness. So, love this topic. This is very interesting. There is this protein that exists in muscle and brain tissue. It's called a prion protein. Now, this protein is a misshapen protein, and it's called an infectious protein in that it binds to other protein and causes them to misfold as well. And then what happens is, as it's going around causing other proteins to misfold, it forms these plaques, which cause the cells that the proteins are in to break apart, and then it causes this, what they call spongiform brain tissue. So this type of disease is called spongiform encephalopathy, and encephalopathy meaning pathology in the brain, the cephalus. And other things that you may have heard of that are the exact same, essentially, as this, is something called mad cow disease. So you have a cow, it's out there in the world. Let's say some farmer somewhere is feeding this cow some kind of mixed up food, and it's got other cow meat in it. And so these cows, without any knowledge of their own and without their consent, I might add, probably, they end up cannibalizing other cows. And then in doing this prion protein spreads to them. And then if we eat mad cow meat, then we get something called variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is a spongiform encephalopathy, a prion disease that affects us, and we get that from ingesting meat that is infected with prion proteins. Now, the agricultural industry and the cow industry, they are very strictly regulated about this, and they are all very careful about that. So thankfully, this is an extremely rare thing that happens, but it is a very interesting thing nonetheless. There are some transmissible forms, or I should say, forms that don't come from directly eating something. They're what we call idiopathic, which means they just kind of happen. And that's also called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, but it's not a variant. It's the OG. All very interesting. So this tribe, in their culture, it was normal to consume their dead. And that was their way of honoring them. But as a result of that, then they got this thing called guru, which was, this really aggressive dementia that would develop, and their behavior would change, personality would change, and it's extremely, extremely bad. 6-month lifespan, terrible, even less sometimes. So anyways, that's guru. Very interesting, terrible. It's a whole thing. But thanks for letting me go on a little walkabout with that one. We got Hutchinson-Gilford syndrome, a progeria variant causing premature aging in childhood. So I've never heard of this one. There are so many out there. It's not uncommon to hear about, even if you're in the biz, to hear about ones that you don't know about. And I've never seen this, but it exists. Okay, onwards. Dancing plague of 1518. Dozens of people danced uncontrollably in Strasbourg for weeks, possibly due to mass hysteria or ergot poisoning. Whoa, that's crazy. That is wild. That would be terrible. It reminds me of that scene in Hocus Pocus. Remember when they put the spell on them? And then all the parents at that dance are stuck dancing for the whole night. This is a more serious version of that probably, but pretty wild. happens to me or you is where I'm at. I hope none of these things do, to be honest with you. Perry-Romberg syndrome, a rare condition where facial tissue wastes away on one side of the face, possibly autoimmune in origin. That's very interesting. You have to wonder if it's like some kind of nerve thing. So what can happen is if a muscle loses its nerve input, then it stops getting a signal. And so, what happens if you work out for a while, your muscles get big. If you stop working out, your muscles get small, you get weaker. And that relies on, as part of that puzzle, these nerves sending signals to cause them to contract. And if you stop getting a signal, then muscles can waste. So I don't know much about this one, but I have to imagine it has something to do with that. Especially if it's only on one side, because so much of the way that the brain and the brain stem innervate our body is in hemispheres. And so that makes me think it's some kind of neurologic thing, and it could very well be an autoimmune disorder. So fascinating. Ondine's curse. I've never in my days heard of a medical condition called a curse, but they all are technically. Congenital central hypoventilation syndrome causes people to stop breathing during sleep. Terrible. We're so lucky that our breathing is an autonomic, regulated thing. We don't have to think about it. It just happens, There's all kinds of things that feed into that, like our blood gases, how much the partial pressure of oxygen versus carbon dioxide versus bicarbonate, all that stuff that we have. It all feeds back and it regulates our respiratory drive, and among other things. And we don't really have to think about it. You can take over and control. Take nice deep breaths, right? If you're meditating. You can do so much. But that would be terrible. We've talked about sleep apnea a little bit on the channel. That's a different thing. Because what happens is, in sleep apnea, you have, kind of bulky, soft tissue around the upper airways and around the neck. And when we sleep, our muscles, our body relaxes. And what happens is, those tissues kind of collapse on themselves. And if there's a lot of them, then they collapse and kind of close off the airway a little bit. And then you have to generate a lot more pressure from your chest and with breathing to try to push those tissues open to let the air in and out. And, that's what snoring is, right? It's an upper airway obstruction that we are trying to clear. And that sound is like the tissue kind of flapping on itself while we're trying to pass air through that space. So that's the whole thing. But some people, if that pressure is very high, then what happens is they might not be able to overcome that pressure until their need for oxygen is so high that then they breathe. And so you go through periods of what are called apnea, which is like little breaks in breathing. You stop breathing for a little while. Terrible. Okay, next up, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a group of connective tissue disorders that make joints hypermobile and skin unusually stretchy. So there's a lot more to Ehlers-Danlos than that. It's a very complex connective tissue disease, and it can be very, very problematic for people who have it. And I've certainly seen people with this. It's not all that rare, but it's still fairly rare. But it can be quite impairing for people. Okay. Argyria. Excessive silver ingestion causes permanent blue-gray skin discoloration. Permanent. You read that right. Terrible. Heavy metal toxicity can be really terrible and problematic for people. And I've never seen this, but I've certainly heard of it. Okay, this next one, super interesting. Foreign object in the brain for years. The patients have lived with bullets, nails, or shrapnel in their brain for decades without realizing it. It's hard to imagine that, but the brain is such a robust, complex thing. And, we've probably all heard about, the case of Phineas Gage, who was a construction worker way back in the day, and he fell off some scaffolding and landed on a piece of, rebar like reinforcing bar from a construction site, and went straight through, and they were able to save him, and thankfully, but because of where it went through, it impacted his personality. He had all kinds of issues with dysregulation and aggressive behavior and stuff like that. And so, foreign objects in the brain can definitely cause serious effects in terms of, causing your personality to change or having other neurologic impacts, right? But some people, if it's in that exact right spot, I guess, they can have no clinical findings, and it's not probably until it's picked up incidentally, like they go in for a CAT scan for some other random thing, and then suddenly it's determined that they have this other thing in there. It's pretty wild, and that's when we're thankful that they didn't go and get an MRI, because that magnet is powerful, I will say that. Okay. Myiasis, infestation of body tissue by fly larvae, more common in tropical regions. Terrible. Certainly, there are like mango flies, bot flies, and things like that. And when I was in Africa, we had to be very careful because you'd wash your clothes, hang them up on the line, and you'd always have to check them because sometimes these flies would leave their little eggs on your shirt or something like that, and then it would burrow into the skin. There was someone that I was there with who that did happen with. Thankfully, it never happened to me. Thankfully, because that would be nasty. I will say that. Okay. This one's interesting. I have seen this. Geographic tongue. Irregular patches on the tongue surface create a map-like appearance. It's harmless but can cause discomfort. If you're not grossed out easily, you could Google this. It's pretty interesting. Sometimes they get like spirals and stuff like that on the tongue. It's very interesting. Okay. Hypertrichosis languinosa. Fine, soft hair. Grows excessively over the body, sometimes from birth. Other times due to cancer. I've never seen this, but that's very interesting. A little fuzziness, I guess. It's not something that I've ever seen. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity. People report symptoms like headaches and fatigue when near electronics. Those studies haven't found a clear link. That is very interesting. I think about some of these tin hat people who stay out of the forest and they have to be off the grid, you know what I mean? Because if they're around electronics or electricity, then they get, these symptoms and stuff. I've never seen that, but I've certainly heard of it. And I've definitely heard of farmers and people who are around those big windmills, experiencing symptoms and stuff like that over time. And I always wondered if it was because of that whirring sound that it makes, right? If you have to listen to this droning sound all the time, I wonder if that could have some impacts, or if it's the actual electricity and the electromagnetic field that is kind of generated as a result of creating whatever that electricity is from the wind turbines. Super interesting. Thankfully, I don't experience that because that would be terrible. Okay, dermatographia. Skin becomes raised and red when lightly scratched, creating temporary patterns. This is super interesting. It is like a form of urticaria, I think. And I've seen it a couple times. It's pretty rare, but it does exist. And to go along with this is something called cold urticaria, which is exposure to cold triggers that causes hives and swelling. Actually, a friend of mine has this, and they have to be super careful if they go in water that's too cold, or if they're outside in the winter. They get really itchy, terrible hives as a result of just being exposed to the cold, and that is super fascinating. And once again, I'm grateful that I do not have cold urticaria, because that would be awful. Okay, we have hypereclepsia, an exaggerated startle reflex from birth caused by a genetic mutation. That would be pretty bad. You would definitely not enjoy watching scary movies or going out trick-or-treating if that were the case. October would be a really tough month, I think, in general. And yeah, you'd probably need to find a pretty predictable job, right, where people time, because that would be terrible. Okay, we have Leschen-Nyhan syndrome, a rare disorder causing self-mutilating behaviors like lip and finger biting due to uric acid buildup in the body. That is wild and terrible. I feel so bad for those people. Uric acid can be really tough. If it builds up in the joints, you can get gout. Obviously here I've never seen this situation, but that would be really terrible as well. And I don't know if it's because it deposits in the skin and they get like an irritated feeling that they need to deal with it. I'm not really sure, but that's a fascinating one, definitely. Okay, and that is it. Fascinating. That is all very interesting. Whew. That was a lot to take in, and I realized that it might be, some of it is weird, but you know what? The human body is a mysterious and wild and wonderful thing. It gives us so much, but it's not an easy road for a lot of people. I think this is interesting because who knows what people out there in the world are dealing with, right? I think it's important to understand what others can be experiencing. I think that might lend itself well to being more empathetic to the people around us, and certainly there are a lot of people out there dealing with all kinds of wild and interesting and even rare things like what we've talked about today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're not too grossed out by it. Best not to Google, image search any of these things, probably. You might be curious. I know I do get curious, and so I always have a look, but it's easier not to see it if you're a little queasy. Just steer clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave you there for today. Thank you so much for joining. Have a lovely, lovely rest of your weekend or week. Sleep well. Stay hydrated. See your doctor if you need to. And spend some good time